Okay, so yesterday we started looking at voting rules and finished up looking at the impact of the median voter. The fact that in any election, if it's by majority rule, if it's a binary choice, if it's between one thing or another, that the median voter will decide the outcome. That if you rank voters in order of preference, whatever option the median voter goes for, whatever preferences the median voter has, will be the final outcome. Because if the median voter votes in favour, well then clearly everybody ranked above him will also vote in favour. And if the median voter votes against, well then everyone ranked below him will also vote against. So this has seen a run or a rush to the middle ground, as political parties try to capture the middle voter and then hope to get everybody either to the left or to the right of that. So this whole concept of being difficult to distinguish between different political parties. And one impact the median voter has is on how we pay for our services. And the most frequently used method of payment is via taxes, with taxes largely based on the income a person earns. So if everybody pays the same amount, well, the method of pay doesn't really matter. It's the benefit you get from the services if everybody pays the same amount. But under a proportional, and more particularly under a progressive tax system, the burden of payment, or the increased amount of payment, is passed on to those with higher incomes. So hence the median voter has the incentive to vote for higher provision, simply because it'll be somebody else that'll be bearing a greater proportion of the cost. And you can see this from the distribution of income. So the distribution of income isn't symmetrical. It is heavily skewed and has a very long right tail, where you have some people earning huge incomes, but they tend to be a very small minority of people. The greater majority of people are bunched or grouped together around what we'll call low or middle incomes. So we have different ways of describing a distribution, different measures of central tendency. How can we describe a particular distribution? So one way is to look at the most frequent observation. And we refer to the most frequent observation as being the mode. What is the modal value? What value occurs more often than not? We also have the mean or average value. And with the long right tail in the income distribution, the mean, if we look at the average, will be pushed out to the right because of the huge incomes earned by a small minority of people. And the third measure of central tendency we have is the median. The median being the middle. So the area under this line here, this is a distribution. So the total area will be 100%. Everybody comes somewhere in the distribution. What the median does is split the area so that there's 50% of the probability to the left and 50% to the right. So the median is in the middle. With the distribution of income, it's quite easy to see that the median is below the mean. So when people are looking for average incomes, they won't tend to use the statistical average or the statistical mean, because it'll be heavily skewed by a small number of huge outliers. When talking about average wages, you get measures such as the average industrial wage, where the whole idea of saying the average industrial wage is to try and eliminate what's happening out here. Eliminate the very high earners. What would an average person earn in the average blue-collar job, rather than having it influenced by huge amounts of incomes earned by a small number of people. So the issue here is that the median voter will pay less than the mean. If you have a proportional tax system, the median voter will pay less than the mean. So hence the incentive is for the median voter to ask for greater levels of public provision, because a larger proportion of the cost will be borne by somewhere else. And this is repeated over and over and over again. And then if you have a progressive tax system, well, that even highlights and extends that. But if you're not having everybody paying the same percent, if if the percent increases as income increases, well then again the median voter will look for increased levels of public provision. So there is kind of consequences about how you can overcome that or how you can alleviate the impact of that. Of course, our tax system isn't entirely based on income tax. We do also have indirect taxes, VAT and excise duty, and these tend to hit disproportionately on the lower income. Because if you're paying VAT, the lower income tend to spend more of their money. There will be those who will argue that the VAT system is designed to try and protect the lower incomes because of the different rates. The 0, 12.5 and now 23% rate, with the standard 23% rate only due to apply to luxury goods, whereas most of the goods that would be bought by lower income people should be on 0 or 12.5%. We have excise duties which are most heavily placed, what we call the old reliables, cigarettes, fuel and alcohol. And again, it's likely that these are highly regressive, that poorer people spend a higher proportion of their income on those products. It's not necessarily that they spend more. Richer people could spend more money on cigarettes, fuel and alcohol than poorer people, but it's important to measure the proportion. So as a proportion they could be spending more, so it could be regressive. So you can, in a sense, counter it and say, look, if we want to have greater public services, we want to have larger indirect taxes, and they are more likely to affect those on lower income levels rather than those on higher income levels. And I suppose then you get sort of political choices. If we have X service, we can't have Y service, and then choosing between those. The whole concept of opportunity cost, but that doesn't tend to get much of an airing, particularly when you're taking away a service that already existed. So as we're going through the current crisis, there have been cuts in particular areas. I suppose a common refrain is, why me? Like, why is this being cut? So you'll hear people making references to other areas where cuts aren't being made. So the median voter can be quite important. So looking at direct democracy, where you ask people to vote directly on issues, rather than having indirect or representative democracy, which for most issues is what most countries have. With representative democracy, you elect representatives to make the decisions. With direct democracy, it's the people themselves who make all the decisions. So some countries do have more levels of direct democracy than others. In Ireland, it's generally just to do with the constitution. When do you go and ask the people to actually make a policy decision? It really is only to do with changes in the constitution. When it comes to legislation and other changes, they're all done by representative democracy. We elect the people who make the decisions. So it's up to us to put the 166 into the Dáil, the 60 into the Seanad, that we want to make those decisions. But there are countries who use large amounts of direct democracy. Switzerland, in their cantons, a lot of taxation and expenditure decisions are made by direct democracy. Actually ask the people, are you in favour of this? California in the US are fairly infamous for using propositions, and we'll come back to that in due course, where they ask the population again, are you in favour of a particular proposition? Not necessarily an act or a bill or an amendment, but just a particular change. And again, going to the population and asking under direct democracy, rather than saying they're having a state congress or a state legislator to look at it. So in Ireland we largely use representative democracy, but there are cases where direct democracy is used. And it could be expanded. In the US, local government has the ability to raise taxes. So they could have a property tax of maybe 2% on the value of somebody's home. The local authority, the local government could decide to raise that to 4%, and they'd ask the people. And what then would the money be used for? It would be used in local areas, for local services, local amenities, local provision. But if the people want it, they have to pay for it, and all the money stays locally. In Ireland, we've introduced the household charge, and that money goes to local authorities. But the local authorities had nothing to do with raising it, and the local authorities have no ability to change it. What if a population, a particular local authority, wants greater levels of local authority services? Like, there is no mechanism for them to raise the funds. Why why couldn't they go and say, look, we're introducing a €500 household charge, and this is what you're going to get extra? And then ask the people, do you want that? Here's the extra cost, here's the extra benefit, you decide. As it is, we sort of have a system where the tax is enforced, but again, it's easy for people to object to it because they don't see the benefits. It's just a €100 charge without any additional benefits. Whereas under direct democracy, you can present both sides. So what are some of the inefficiencies that can arise under direct democracy? Well, if the proposed tax is progressive or proportional, you can get excessive supply. So under majority voting, with the proportional tax system, the outcome is likely to be excess supply, and this will particularly occur if the median voter has lower than average income, which is going to be the case. Under direct democracy, you can get the importance of agenda setting. Can you control the order in which alternatives are presented? And if you can do that, you can actually control the outcome. That regardless of people's preferences, regardless of people's choices, if you can control the agenda, you can control the outcome. If there's a position where there are multiple peaked preferences, and if the person setting the agenda can spot that, well, then they can use that to their advantage. So the actual outcome isn't based on the preferences, it's based on the order in which they're presented. So if cycles are produced by majority voting, then any element in the cycle can be made the winner by a suitable choice of agenda. Simply making sure you start the cycle in a particular spot to end up in a particular spot. The last element is misrepresentation. Individuals may have incentives to influence the outcome by lying about their preferences. So whether they're in favour or opposed to a particular issue. So with direct democracy, we're going to have a referendum. Like, are people opposed or in favour of the current fiscal treaty? Well, it may be that other issues will feed into it. The household charge, septic tanks, the overall pattern of the government policy in general, where maybe people are using their vote as a protest rather than to reflect their preferences. That if they sat down and looked at it, they might make a particular decision to vote yes or no. But they're actually using the vote to misrepresent their preferences to sell and give an alternative viewpoint. So when looking at voting in general, we've seen that majority voting can lead to inefficiency. You can have agenda setting, misrepresentation, and oversupply. So why not use alternative voting rules? Like, what are the alternative voting rules? Well, the most extreme case is unanimity. 100% agreement. Not a majority of any fashion. 100% agreement, unanimity. So unanimity may, in fact, will produce efficient outcomes. Because everybody must agree. However, it's a hugely costly way to make decisions. And obtaining consensus can be a long-winded affair. So actually, to get everybody to agree, particularly as the electorate gets larger and larger, is likely to add huge costs of actually making the decision. So there are some areas where unanimity is used. So the most high profile in media circles would be the UN Security Council. That requires a unanimous vote in order to pass a resolution. So with unanimity, a country has a veto. Let's see, can we find who's on it? So the UN Security Council has 5 permanent members who have the power to veto any substantive resolution. So it requires unanimous agreement between China, France, Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom. So unless the 5 of those agree, you're not going to get any resolution passed. Regardless of whether you got 3 of the 5 to support it. 2 of them can block it. So we've seen this recently in Syria, where a UN resolution against Syria was blocked, not just by one country, but by 2, by China and Russia, who blocked the resolution against Syria. In fact, one of them could have done it. So the issue is, by having unanimity, you're kind of trying to force decisions that everybody agrees with, that it must really be a strong or a choice with huge preferences in favour, that you're not allowing some countries, in a sense, to have a degree of power that perhaps they don't deserve. So you could have a block of countries, say between France, the UK and the US, trying to force through particular resolutions that might not be in the best interest of everybody. So the whole concept of the veto is to get agreement. But it does mean you must have constant negotiations, maybe even trade-offs, to reach that agreement. The EU was founded on the basis of unanimity. That when the EU was founded, each country had the veto, and the veto spread across a huge range of areas, right through from agricultural policy, economic policy, social policy, legal issues. When the number of members was quite small, each country had the veto, could block any particular let's say, law that might be introduced by the EU. And when the EU started off and was small, had less than 10 members, then got to 12, then got to 15, this was relatively easy to fashion, that they could undertake the negotiations between 12 members and actually get unanimity. Increasingly, the EU has moved more to qualified majority voting. That you don't need 100% agreement. Now, with 27 members and the likelihood of further members down along, looking for unanimity is virtually impossible. Are you going to get 27 countries to agree to everything? When it comes to some of the larger decisions, unanimity is still needed. So the treaties, most of the main treaties, require unanimity. So the last couple of referendum we had here on Nice and Lisbon were actually important in a European context, because the population of Ireland could block those treaties. They needed 100% agreement. So they were considered so important that they were the treaties about the functioning of the European Union that they needed unanimity. But when it comes to actually decisions of the European Council, decisions at either Prime Minister level, Head of State level, or decisions at ministerial level, so the EU Council or the Council of Ministers, there's increasingly a move to qualified majority voting. You can't have 27 people sitting around the table and trying to get them all to agree. And we've seen this most visibly with the current treaty. The current treaty is, in a sense, not a full-scale treaty. It's not a huge treaty change. This fiscal stability treaty is sort of a minor element in the sidelines of EU law. And because of this, it doesn't require unanimity. We can't stop it. All we can vote on is whether we accept it or not. And within the Eurozone, it will come into force if 12 of 17 members pass it. So it doesn't require a huge amount of passing. It is a qualified majority. It's not 9 out of 17, it is 12 out of 17. And because most of them will pass it in their parliaments, it will easily get the 12 of 17. And it doesn't even need any further support from the 10 countries outside of the Euro. Already the UK and the Czech Republic have refused to sign it. So there's only 25 left. And however many of the other 8 choose to sign it, well, that's up to them. Perhaps one of the reasons why a lot of the other 8 will sign it is because they want to move into the Euro in due course. Some of the new accession countries. So it'll likely be a precondition of entry into the common currency. So it's likely that most of those other 8 will do so. But the UK and the Czech Republic have stayed outside it. So we've come a long way from the unanimity. So the power in this referendum is much reduced. It's basically just down to us, whether we want to vote for it or not, rather than under the old system where we could have vetoed it. And I suppose the key issue is that the rules have come into play anyway. Even though the UK and the Czech Republic are staying away from the treaty, we mightn't pass it, other countries mightn't pass it. All 27 members are subject to the rules. The rules are in the Stability and Growth Pact. That's not a treaty, that's just signing up to obey by certain conditions of being a member of a particular club. You have to agree to the rules of the club. The Stability and Growth Pact is one of the rules. So we've already signed up to it. The whole treaty is about whether you make them binding and permanent. Are they just rules that the EU has that we sort of look at and say we'll obey it or we won't obey it? Or are they rules we put into our constitution? So we will be standing or living by the rules anyway. So it doesn't matter whether we put them into the constitution and open ourselves up to being taken to the European Court of Justice to actually say we're going to live up to them. So in the EU, we see the increasing use of qualified majority voting. And the qualified is just a certain percentage, be it 12 out of 17 Eurozone members for the current treaty. And one of the big issues in the Lisbon Treaty was voting rights at council level. So there's votes per country, each country has a vote, and then there's votes based on size. So the qualified majority voting system in the EU is quite complex. You must have a certain number of countries, and then they must be of a particular size, have a certain amount of population. So in the population one does give a degree of power to the larger countries. So you have the likes of Germany, the UK, Italy, France, Spain, with large populations. But then the rule requiring a number of countries is supposed to give some power back to the smaller members. That even if the larger countries group together, if the 5 of those largest countries group together, they would meet the population criteria each and every time. But they must get some of the smaller countries to support them in order to reach the second criteria, the qualified majority voting on the basis of numbers. And this was sort of part of the debate under the Lisbon Treaty. Like, would countries have power? Would countries have the veto? One area where the veto maintains is in taxation policy. Europe will not move forward with taxation policy unless it's unanimous. So it's unlikely to form a part of this debate, but many of the press releases that come out of the recent summits recognise Ireland's openness to discuss the common consolidated corporate tax base. And if you look at various EU summits, that statement is put into it frequently. It doesn't say we're agreeing to it, but does say that we're open to discuss the common consolidated corporate tax base. What that simply means is that corporate tax in Europe will be taken from a common base, that companies would pay the corporate tax where they earn the profit, not where they book it. So in Ireland, the pharmaceuticals will book a lot of profit through Ireland. So they'll manufacture the active ingredient in Ireland, and that's where most of the profit is. So the prime time on Tuesday night showed that pharmaceutical companies in Ireland pay 3/4 of all corporation tax paid in Ireland. In employment stakes, the pharmaceutical sector is quite small, possibly around 40,000. About 2% of the workforce. When it comes to corporation tax, they're paying 75%. And a lot of that is because they're selling pharmaceuticals into Europe. So selling them to Germany, selling them to Italy, selling them to France, but booking the profits here. So the common consolidated corporate tax base, the view is that the tax should be paid where the profit is earned. So if a pharmaceutical sells a medical product to a German citizen, that's where it earns the profit. Not by using pricing perhaps to get the profit into Ireland. So we've been open to agree to discuss it, but we've never been open to agree to implement it. And that is likely to stay. As long as the veto stays on taxation, unanimity, the common consolidated corporate tax base can't be introduced. Because if we didn't have the veto there, it would essentially be like Europe changing our tax code without our agreement. We charge corporation tax on profits earned in Ireland. If the common consolidated corporate tax base came in, other countries will be charging corporation tax on profits earned in Ireland. And that's not going to be introduced without agreement between all the countries. So while our corporation tax is important, we're unlikely to lose it. It doesn't form part of the current treaty, even though it perhaps sees some attempts made to introduce it. It was important in the Lisbon Treaty because they were changing the voting rules. Where does the veto still stand? And it still stands in tax issues, but there's a whole host of issues where they've moved to qualified majority voting.